Hello, folks. Welcome back to our channel again. This is Om Prakash. Today we're going to be reading from a book called The Chronicles of Kera, Book 1, Kera King and Queen by Om Prakash Gilmore. We're going to start off with chapter 4 because we read the other chapters on something called fan base. You might want to check fan base out. The officer at the gate checked George's ID and made a quick call. A jeep with two shore patrol pulled up and escorted us into the naval yard. I started to think that the thing could be real. We went through this city within a city, passing old brick buildings and shops, aircraft carriers and battleships docked, until we came to a small airfield. From there we were hustled to a DC-5 painted camouflage. George looked a bit surprised. We found some seats near the rear of the plane. I don't know where we're going, he said quietly. They must have moved it. Damn right, another soldier interrupted. He looked like an officer. His stern look broke into a grin that split his face. General Josephson, George said, grinning, starting to stand to salute. The general flagged him off. As you were. Don't bother to get up. No need for that. He squatted in front of us as George sat back down. Did you think we'd leave it here? The general asked. He looked over at John and me. Just how much have you told him, George? I told him most of it, George said. They must be good friends, he continued. He looked at us again. I would like to thank you for serving your country. You'll be rewarded. If we can figure out this technology, it could mean a new world. It could mean the end of hunger, to energy problems, to sickness, even a war. We could create a new world with this new technology, gentlemen. He sounded sincere, like he really believed it. John was silent, but I wasn't. You think this thing is real then? Huh? Real? I saw the goddamn thing come down. It's real, believe me. This thing had a fucking shield up that was so strong we couldn't get through. For almost a month we tried to get that goddamn thing open. I still don't know how we did it. The thing is for real. We just don't know how to open it. Why us? John asked. What makes you think we'll be able to do it? He looked at George and smiled. A strong recommendation from a good friend, he said. George smiled broadly and genuinely. I know that you can be trusted if George trusts you. And that, he said, is the most important thing. We know that you can be trusted. John pursed his lips for a moment. Just where are we going, General, since we're trusting each other, so to speak? We're going to Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where we can experiment on this thing without being noticed. When we crack this technology, anything will be possible. I hope we crack it, but what happens after that? I asked sincerely. Why, you fly it, the general said. He looked perplexed. You are pilots, aren't you? Oh, yes, John said, but... Oh, I know, the general said. You've only piloted little crop dusters and the like, but we have a flight simulator that will bring you up to speed fast. You can just use it 24/7. By the time you're done with the craft, you'll be able to fly it. Us? I asked. You expect us to fly it? I guess George forgot to tell you that part, the general bellowed. He broke into a hearty laugh. George cleared his throat. I was going to save that for later, General. The general grinned. Maybe I should let you brief them a little before I open my big mouth again, he said, like a question. He groaned as he forced himself up onto his feet. Carry on, General. George smiled and nodded as the general headed back to the front of the plane. We both looked at George, piercingly. He shrugged. Oops. I would have told you sooner or later. Now we're supposed to fly planes, John whispered. What do you mean we? I asked. I already know how to fly a plane. John sucked his teeth and shook his head. My father had his own plane, I said. When we were kids, we used to fool with it. John shook his head and I began to feel a bit embarrassed. It was a small plane. It was just a Piper Cub. It wasn't anything really big. The last sentence sounded a bit hollow to me. You know what I mean, I said in disgust. I'll walk you through the simulator. There won't be any problem. You said this thing would change our lives, George, John commented. It just might kill us. We're not test pilots. Well, I am, so don't worry. My jaw dropped as I wondered just what this man did in the Army. Chapter 5, we were purposely guided. It was hot in Cuba in late August. We were whisked away through the heat and into an air-conditioned hangar so fast that we could barely tell where we were. From there, we were taken to an elevator that led to a deep underground cavern. There was a large underground computer center in front of the elevator doors. To the right, large hallways, like the kind you find in a hospital, branched out in three directions. We were purposely guided through a maze of hallways to our living spaces. We lived in small rooms that resembled dormitories. They were very sparse but surprisingly well lit and had satellite TV. Of course, there was limited phone service. We couldn't get connected to the larger world. We were given a couple of hours to settle in, and then we were fitted for clothing. It felt like we were joining the army or something. We received large white coveralls with a thick leather belt around the waist. It served mostly as a tool belt and pockets, since there were no pockets in the jumpsuits. They wanted to know what we had at all times. This was to prevent any possibility, of course, of spying. We arrived at the base 1500 hours. By 1600, we had received our rooms, our uniforms, toothpaste, deodorant, toothbrushes, a couple of pairs of shoes, and maps. It showed us how to navigate our way in and out of the maze, just in case of an emergency. After 1700, we had dinner. The food was good. It was much better than expected. Prime rib and the like. I wondered if the soldiers there were eating it well. At 1800, we received our orientation. We were told about lights on, light out, and surprisingly, we were told not to leave the compound under any circumstances or to get in contact with anyone until the project was done and we had been fully debriefed. We were also told that we would be paid very well and thanked for being willing to be of service to the United States of America. At 1900 hours, we made our way through a series of hallways to see this so-called spaceship. I knew by then that something was there. I wasn't stupid. We met George, the supervising colonel in charge of the project. That's not George, excuse me, that's Jorge. Jorge was a slender man about 5 foot 6 inches tall and an inch shorter than I was. That made me feel pretty good. He was Latino. Jorge had studied at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and had gotten his master's at California Technical Institute. He was born on the island of Puerto Rico. His family moved to Hartford, Connecticut, since they had dual citizenship. They were middle-class people when they arrived. They had been forced to leave Puerto Rico when their land was confiscated and turned into a golf course and a resort. They had been lucky enough, because of their previous status, to at least get a fraction of what the land was worth. With that money, they settled in Hartford, where they lived comfortably. We made our introductions, but I guess the fact that I couldn't wait to see the ship was obvious. We walked down a series of hallways quickly until we came to a large room that looked like a shop. We could see inside from the hallway through a wall of thick, bulletproof glass. The UFO was inside here, Jorge said, punching in his code. Remember your codes. You have to get in and out this way, too. He looked up and smiled as he pulled the heavy door open. Getting out of here without the code is a real bitch. A UFO, I thought. I laughed to myself. I could hardly wait. Chapter 6. To cover a Porsche with a paper bag. I could have waited. I looked at a big canvas thing sitting on the floor in front of me on a helicopter launch pad. I smirked a bit, asked from the corner of my mouth. So this is it. Looks like a giant canvas bedpan turned upside down. John grinned but didn't say a word. George's eyes narrowed. He pursed his lips. Before he could speak, Jorge jumped in. Don't be deceived, my friend. This is just a custom-made cover. Would you expect to cover a Porsche with a paper bag? I must admit, that thought had not crossed my mind. He pulled something from his pocket that looked like a garage door opener, pointed at the object, and clicked it. I noticed the cover moving. Only then did I notice the thin nylon ropes from the ceiling that were hooked to a tarp at strategic points. The tarp lifted slowly, revealing what looked like a shiny bedpan turned upside down. I didn't dare say anything. It looked much bigger for some reason than it did when it was covered by the tarp. It was somewhat oval-shaped. It must have had a radius of about 30 feet. That was very impressive. We walked over and began to examine it. John ran his hands over the metal. Strange feeling, energy-wise, he said. Cool to the touch. Jorge had a questioning look on his face. He does energy work, I said. What kind of energy work? Healing mumbo jumbo, George interrupted with a grin. Oh, Jorge said, scratching his chin. Then you are a healer or shaman of some type. Yes, a little, John said, looking over the ship. Can't you feel the energy when you touch this thing? I've never seen metal like this. It almost has a living quality to it. I had to make note of that, Jorge said. I'm glad you two are here. Maybe you'll give us new ways of looking at this thing. What's that in the front up there? I pointed towards the top of the vehicle. Is that a window? Jorge looked from a different angle. I believe so. He scratched his head. I've never seen it before. It must have been something that you did. He directed his attention to John. John shrugged. George shook his head, and a grin forced itself out of him. I can't believe it. He laughed under his breath. That mumbo-jumbo really worked. He laughed again, but more openly. We both ignored him. We were used to it. Jorge observed us. He smiled pleasantly. Looks like this thing is going to be very interesting. I've been fooling around with this thing by myself. It'll be good to have some company around. Everybody else seems to be scared of the thing. He looked up at the ship, took a deep breath, and then turned back to us. It seems beautiful to me, though. He smiled. I feel a strange vibe from it, too, like it's alive. George rolled his eyes and shook his head. We looked at him for a moment and then ignored him as usual. George thought that he knew everything. If he hadn't heard of it or could not prove it scientifically, he didn't believe it. I have some reports, observations, and technical readouts that I would like to share with you. Maybe you can look them over tonight, and we can get a fresh start tomorrow. I nodded. Sounds good. I leaned closer. How about that code to get in? I asked. I'll set it up. Just give me some significant numbers and I'll be having it activated for those numbers by the morning. Let me find some paper, Jorge said, looking around. George reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a notepad. He handed it to Jorge. Now if I just had a pen, Jorge said. George pursed his lips, pulled out a pen, and handed it to Jorge. He reached in. Then he recorded the numbers. Now if I just had a sexy woman, he said. George couldn't produce one of those. Jorge smiled and arched his brows. We walked over to a drawing table in the corner on the side of the door hidden by the opaque section of the wall. He gave us a research notebook, sketches, photos, and all the records from the projects in a briefcase as big as an overnight case. We took them back. to John's room and studied them well into the night. Chapter 7. Looked down and shook his head. The sun rose early, too early. I almost fell asleep in the gym doing my Tai Chi form. I had been doing Tai Chi since I was 7 years old. This form was really old. I had been doing it for almost 20 years, the same old form. Sometimes I would do more warm-ups differently, but the Tai Chi form was the same and it still wasn't perfect. It was difficult to balance this morning. I knew that I was very tired. John sat in the lotus position, meditating across from me. George jogged on the treadmill at a quick, steady pace. He looked over every so often, looked down, and shook his head. I finally stopped doing my form. "What are you laughing for?" I asked. John opened his eyes and listened. "You guys aren't American, are you?" "What do you mean American?" John asked. "American, exercising. Not doing that foreign stuff. That's not exercise." They picked up the pace on the treadmill. "This is exercise. Get your heart pumping. Your muscles warmed up." I went back to my form, and John began to meditate again. George just kept running and made clucking sounds at us every so often. It was a good workout for all of us, even if we chose to work out in different ways. By the time we got breakfast and went to the lab, we were in good states of mind. Jorge was already there taking notes when I punched in my code. The door swung easily on its hinges. The others followed me in. "Good morning," Jorge said from behind the drawing table. I sat in the corner near a wall full of wrenches, drill bits, oscilloscopes, and many other tools. Along the adjacent wall there were a few doors that led out to the main area and to coffee break rooms. One led to a lab and one to a restroom. We found some very used chairs in various parts of the shop and pulled them around the table. John plopped the notebook and all the papers and folders down onto the desk. Jorge looked up expectantly. "Find anything?" he asked, arching his brows. John shook his head. Jorge frowned. "I think it is all about energy," John said. "You've been working on this thing with mechanics, but we've used electric sound waves, everything," Jorge complained. "How about bioenergy?" John asked. "We haven't used any of that," George interrupted. "With you around, I'm not surprised," I said. "No such thing as bioenergy," George said. "I rest my case," I said. John looked at him intensely, trying to think of the best way to explain bioenergy. "Bioenergy is the subtle energy created by the human system. Everything alive has bioenergy, or it wouldn't be. EEGs, EKGs, all of those scientific measurements of the human system that we take for medical treatment are reading bioenergy. Why can't an advanced people find a way to make a system that responds to that bioenergy the same way that door," he motioned with his head towards the door, "responds to mechanical energy? Energy really is energy after all. It would have to be able to measure such subtle energy," Jorge conjectured. "I wonder if it's possible." He walked over to the panel and pushed the button to raise the tarp. It slowly rose upwards, revealing the ship. It looked a little bit more attractive since the first time I had seen it. I guess my greater expectation had ruined it for me. It was a beautiful ship. It looked like polished stainless steel, but there was a thin film that retracted the light in a rainbow pattern if you looked at it from a certain angle. We stepped into the circle surrounding the ship. I walked over and ran my hand along the metal. It felt cool at first. After a few moments, it began to feel very warm. I began to wonder if my hand had just warmed up the metal or something else was going on. "Look at it," George said, looking right above my hand. A circle had appeared. It was duller than the rest of the ship. barely visible. We all moved closer to see it. It remained after I removed my hand. My God, you could be right, John, Jorge exclaimed. After a few moments, the circle just disappeared. I placed my hand on the ship again and nothing happened. I stood there for a few minutes, but the circle never came back. Well, there goes your theory, John, George said. No, he replied. It aligns completely with my theory. Rob must have been doing something the first time that he's not doing now. His expectations, us standing around, whatever, must be altering his thoughts and making him alter his bioenergy. If he could think the way that he was thinking then and feel the same way, the same thing would happen. He moved forward and put his hand on the ship. This thing really feels alive. I'm afraid that we are going to have to be able to control our thoughts, our feelings, and our emotions to ever be able to get into it or to control it. That's impossible, George griped. For some of us, anyway, John answered. George sucked his teeth loudly. Here we go again with your meditation crap, John. My meditation crap? Behold. He placed his hand on the ship, took a few deep breaths. The small circle appeared right above his hand, just as it appeared above mine, even though his hand was down lower. My crap. He removed his hand. After a moment, the circle disappeared. Well, gentlemen, he said, I guess we begin meditation tomorrow. George jerked himself upright. Begin meditation? You didn't open it. John spread his hands. That's because I couldn't stay in a peaceful state long enough. His eyes narrowed a bit more than he wanted. Especially around you, George. If I do all of that meditation and can't sustain the right energy, just think about you guys who don't do any. Meditation begins 4 a.m. in the morning, he said brightly, and turned to Jorge. Can you get us a biofeedback machine, Jorge? I can get you anything you need, Jorge said. He grinned. He looked at George to see his reaction. He couldn't wait to see George getting his butt out of the bed at 4 a.m., especially to meditate. George tightened his jaw and glared at Jorge, which only made Jorge beam. John and I picked up on what was happening. John grinned so wide that he could barely talk. Good, he said. I'm glad that's settled. He craned his neck towards the ship and moved closer. Now let's see if we can do this again. I guess we can take it step by step till we get it. Take notes over and over until we know exactly what to do to operate every system. It will be a very long process. And so we stop here in our book and we will pick up again in another video. Thanks for being with us, and we hope that you will enjoy this one greatly and many more. The name of the book is in the description and it's available at Amazon.com. Thank you once again. Namaste.